On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Yash Desai. He is the head of B2B machine learning at Wayfair. We're going to be talking about building machine learning teams. So Yash has a great background, deep in machine learning. He comes from consulting, and we're going to talk about some of how that experience has helped him at Wayfair. We're going to be talking about how you simply just have more time and how you manage your roadmap and fostering team culture and managing a team that stretches across multiple business units. Yash, super excited to have you here.
Thanks, Amir. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome, man. So let's start off with two things. One, I'm pretty sure what most people know what Wayfair does, but tell us what Wayfair does as a business, and then also what are some of your responsibilities of head of B2B machine learning there?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wayfair is one of the largest e-commerce companies in the US in the field of home goods and furniture. And very recently, I want to say like last 5 years ago, it started off its B2B arm. So not just serving consumers, but also businesses. And that's where I come in. I was brought in to kind of lead the machine learning organization for this B2B arm of Wayfair. And so my team kind of covers all aspects of machine learning, all the way from marketing, sales, service, and pricing. So yeah, happy to dive more into it.
Awesome. So I guess, we're talking about building teams. So maybe at a high level, let's talk about, you mentioned your team spans multiple business units, and obviously that in of itself has some unique constraints, but maybe talk about, how that team is set up and kind of, how wide your responsibilities are, and we'll kind of dive in from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll give a bit of context of, how I kind of fell into this and why I took it up.
Sure.
I kind of attributed more as maybe a hangover from my consulting days where I would naturally gravitate a lot towards breadth of topic instead of depth of topic. And this particular role kind of excited me because it was almost like leading a mini startup within Wayfair, right? So that's how I got into it. And, as I mentioned, my team does machine learning all the way from, marketing, like top of funnel to very downstream, like how do we, increase profits from our existing customers. So in terms of challenges, I think of 4 or 5 main challenges that I currently face. The first one being domain knowledge. And maybe a related one is having the bandwidth to dive deeper into them. The next one is there are a lot of unique infrastructure or organizational challenges across these business units. So how do you kind of tackle them? Third one, which is personal to me as a leader in this space of context switching, right? So I have this one conversation in the morning where I'm talking to a marketing leader about, okay, how do we start up an email campaign? And then in 30 minutes, I'm talking to a pricing leader about discount recommendations. 2 totally disjoint topics. And then finally, how do you build relationships, right? Because you don't want to just, have this tactical and, more of a transactional relation, but having a more strategic thought partnership. So the way I've kind of addressed some of these issues, number one is organizing a team into sub-teams or pods, right? To take an example, if I have, let's say, 10 data scientists or engineers on my team and I'm addressing both marketing and sales, I would just split them into 5 focusing just on marketing and 5 focusing just on sales. So there's focus. And then it also helps the engineers get aligned to what their interests are and learn about the business even more. The second thing that we often do as technical leaders is we were always taught that, hey, don't expect your business partners to know anything about machine learning or even stats 101. But the reverse is not true. Your business leaders will often expect you to know about the business. So be upfront. Just tell them that, hey, I don't know anything about sales. You need to teach me, right? So don't be afraid of just raising your hand and asking for help and asking clarifying questions. So that's what I typically do, especially in this situation when I'm spread so thin. I just go in and tell my business partners that, hey, I would love to learn about, how do you do your marketing campaigns? And that kind of, sets the right expectation, sets the right tone from the very beginning. And then finally, the practical thing that I do for context switching is I block time before meetings. So I know that, okay, this is an important meeting coming up. So I don't want to just go in without having a clear agenda and a clear mind. So even if it's 10 minutes, it just helps me kind of, get into the mold, get into the groove before I go into the meeting. And then the last one that I talked about was relationships, right? What happens is if you're addressing or you are working with different business units, you mostly focus on the tactical and more pragmatic issues, but you never really build those deeper relationships, right? So you have to be super deliberate, set up those one-on-ones, go for coffee chat, go for golf over the weekend, whatever it may, it may take you to do to build that relationship, because otherwise, you'll end up building that patchwork of solutions and never get into the scalable or repeatable work that would, eventually build a great organization.
I guess, maybe to dive into some of that, because I think there's a lot of, stuff there to unpack. I guess when you're looking at these different units, and I understand context switching has to be, a challenge, and, going into a new area, asking for help. When you're looking to set up your department's roadmap, I guess how do you go about that, right? So obviously there's a lot of moving parts, lots of different teams balancing that. Like, how does the planning happen for your roadmap on your team?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question, right? Like, what I say to this, and again, it's going to sound like a very cliched diplomatic answer, but I'll say it anyway, is I try to marry both top-down mandates and like bottom-up crowdsourcing. And I deliberately use the words mandates and crowdsourcing because top-down comes from senior executives and leadership. And, they'll just tell you, hey, we need to grow the business. We need to bring more profit. Go figure out how you'll use machine learning for it. And then that just sets the agenda, sets the tone. But then bottom up, you have your team, which is, really in the weeds. They know how things work. And they'll come to you and say, hey, Yash, I'm spending so much time doing the same thing over and over again to clean the data. Why don't we do something to have a pipeline or have a repeatable process? So you do want to listen to them, right? Because, that their time is valuable. So that's how I kind of try to combine the roadmaps in a way that, it both addresses the business objectives as well as addresses concerns from within the team. And then obviously you go through your standard process of what's the value at stake? Are these projects bringing in the return on investment that you expect? What is the urgency and feasibility, right? Because there might be some very high value at stake projects, but then there's no urgency, or they're not feasible because, let's say, GDPR issues in Europe, like, it's a big thing. It's going to bring a lot of profit, but you're just stuck because of legal reasons. So then you don't want to put it on your roadmap. And then finally work with your business partners to make sure that you're fully aligned, that they have the capacity to take your model and put it in use. Otherwise, you might end up with, an army of models which are great and fancy and shiny, but then no one's using them. So, it's of no use to anyone.
And I can completely understand the predicament. I mean, you have different, you're pretty broad, at being asked to go into new business areas. So to maybe follow up to that question, when there's conflicting, requirements, you have different stakeholders, somebody's got to be disappointed, right? Not everyone can be met. Somebody has to be prioritized. When you're going about that process, how does that look? Because obviously that's a trade-off. Like, your team has a certain amount of bandwidth unless they want to, add to your budget or whatnot. But what does that look like when you have competing stakeholders who seemingly have priority? Everyone has priority needs, but seemingly, top tier priority needs.
I think that's the most difficult part of this job. I would say, like, when what we call brutal prioritization, like, you have to do it and you have to have those difficult conversations. And I think this is where my point from, your previous question comes into picture is, do you have that relationship where your partner is going to understand why you're not prioritizing their projects, right? So I do it in 2 or 3 different ways. The first one, which is, just my DNA, is data. I use data to influence people, right? I tell them that, hey, these are all the 5 projects. My team can only do 3 of them. And I've just rank ordered them based on the return on investment. And unfortunately, your project falls below the threshold. So I'll do it, but maybe not this half, the next half, right? So just data, no one can refute data, right? It is what it is. The second one is just influencing based on, for the lack of better word, authority. Like, you just use other senior leaders' help, kind of bring them onto your camp and say that, hey, why don't you champion the cause for me, and go to this particular other business leader and tell them that, hey, for now, this is the most important project that we can do. And, of course, your project is important too, but we'll have to wait until we finish this other high priority project, right? So just maybe bringing in another senior leader. And then the flip side of it, which is working with someone from within the team, like a junior person, and having them champion for you, right? So it's the same thing, but one is more top down and the other one is more bottom up, where the junior person goes and explains their boss that, hey, I spoke to Yash, what he says makes sense. And, they're more likely to listen to someone to their team from their team versus, someone from a machine learning team.
Yeah, that's obviously it seems like a very practical way. Obviously, people will understand once they go through a cycle with you if you're planning that this is what to expect, and if you fall below that threshold, hey, it's kicked to the next quarter or next cycle.
Yeah, one more thing I'll add is what I've often done in such situations is provide an alternative solution, which is not necessarily machine learning. So sometimes, and I use this as a joke. You don't need a space shuttle to commute to work, right? You can might as well take a bike. By that, what I mean is you don't always need a very fancy machine learning solution to all the problems. You can use simple heuristic solutions, right? Our good old if-else conditions. If a customer has a credit score about 800, give them the loan. Something as simple as that, and you just go in with a solution, and oftentimes it works. So it's not always saying no, but just saying no with an alternative solution.
That makes sense. I actually think that's a really fair way of looking at it. I think, just from a side, it sounds like, from what I hear from other, leaders in machine learning, is that everyone thinks that put in an ML solution is the answer because they've heard it and they think that solves some problems they haven't figured out yet. And so I think sometimes that education component of, while you have an issue, might not require this complex of a solution, which will take us a long time. I guess I wanted to tie in, your background a little bit and kind of mention, obviously I know you worked in the consulting space, the timelines you're working on now. Actually, before we go forward, what are the timelines? So when we're talking about this roadmap, is it a quarterly? Is it, semi-annual, yearly? How long are the roadmaps you're planning?
So the roadmaps could go as long as 12 to 18 months and sometimes even longer. And it depends a lot on the industry, right? So to give you an example, in healthcare, things move a little slower. So you might be looking at longer term horizons and, especially if you're working at a more mature organization, things are well set in place. But if you're at a smaller company, a startup, for example, then you have to be super nimble. You have to be able to pivot quickly, and then your roadmaps might be just 6 months or sometimes even 3 months, like quarterly basis. So yeah, it depends a lot on the size and the maturity of the company. And I've kind of done both ends of the spectrum. But typically, I try to have at least 12 to 18 months of roadmap, and then have intermediate milestones so that we're not just going into a dark corner and coding away, and then just someone wakes us up after 12 months.
And I guess as you're kind of looking at the roadmaps, maybe some of the differences of consulting is as it's brought in from an outside perspective, you have a certain budget, you have a certain amount of time, and you have to deliver. You mentioned healthcare, even what you're doing now, the timelines are longer. How did you, I guess, have to alter your approach of having a more short-term deadline focused deliverable versus, hey, I'm here for the long term, I need to start planning for years, not just the 3 months?
Yeah, and I know we were joking about this earlier. Consulting is what we call consulting my hand grenade. So I think the first thing is a big mindset shift. Going from consulting to industry is calm down. This time, and it's not the end of the world if you had set a deadline of 3 months and then you take 2 additional weeks. So just having that mindset shift is really important. And it's just two very different business models, right? In consulting, you have a very well defined budget and a set timeline. Anything that goes beyond is basically eating into your budget. So what we try to do is there's absolutely no margin for error. So everything has to be super watertight. And what that means is your scope cannot increase. If you're increasing scope, that means you're already outside your timeline, or you just have to sacrifice your weekends. So yeah, just being very cognizant of the fact of keeping the scope super tight. and then going in with a plan B, because things will always go south, especially when you're dealing with technology. You want to make sure that you build in that extra buffer, thinking about what could be the alternate solution, and kind of imbibing it into your timelines and your work plan, so you don't kind of fall off the wagon. Whereas if you're in the industry and you have longer time frames, then I think you have more flexibility to kind of play around. You can move like certain parts of your work plan if you're getting stuck somewhere else. So you can, let's say, be more top heavy or be more bottom heavy, and also grab resources from other parts of your team, which you cannot do in consulting. Right here, if I know that there's a strict deadline and I can do parallel work, I'll just ask someone else to pause their project and then bring them onto this more high priority project.
I guess when you're kind of looking at the shift, and now you're transition to working for Wayfair, and you're pretty you're getting ramped up in that. When you're looking back at your consulting days, and you're looking back at some of those conversations that you mentioned about stakeholder plan B, plan A, and you have to do similar. You mentioned using data to prioritize stakeholders. How much of that consulting switch will turn on and be able to help between plan A, plan B, and prioritizing, and obviously there you still have budgets, but how much of that light just turns on and you're in that mode again?
Oh yeah, it's like second nature to me now. Like it turns on and off like quite often, and I think it's all for the good, right? Because oftentimes, and I say this with utmost respect, you do have machine learning leaders who are like super technical, very sharp, but then they're unable to kind of understand the business perspective. And having that consulting background has really given me that edge and almost like a unique vantage point to be on the other side of the table and understand that, okay, I want to come up with a solution which works for the both of us. And if that means that my accuracy is less by 5%, that's fine. It's not the end of the world. But what's more important is for me to meet the deadline, right? So whereas if you're a purist, if you're coming from a super technical background, you often like look so much of precision and accuracy that you don't always think of, a good solution is sometimes better than a great solution. So I think that's something like, what we call in consulting, like 80-20 principle, like, 80% solution is good enough often.
I want to actually go back to your team at Wayfair, but I had a question, because it comes up when you're finding candidates that come from a consulting background. Sometimes companies look at that and they don't like it. They want you to be more, having that work experience in a product or a company, have that quote unquote the skin in the game, being there long term. But sometimes, just like you have all this different visibility in different projects, models, different ways of operating, different ways of executing, which has so much value. Like that, I don't like the word stigma, but there is a stigma of having worked for consulting and going into an organization. Like, I don't think that's changing anytime soon, but I just want to put that to you because it's kind of, sometimes I find it frustrating. I'm sure candidates who are coming from that background find it frustrating.
That's absolutely true, and I've faced it directly and indirectly. And in sometimes in a good way, that people would say, oh, if someone comes from consulting, they have this certain kind of polish to their communication, and that understanding of business, which is sometimes lacking in a truly technical person. But at the same time, they will say this, that hey, all you did was just recommend. You never really saw the light at the end of the tunnel. So how do you know if what you recommended actually panned out? So it's a fair point, right? And to be honest, in the early parts of my career, that's basically what we did. Like, we built models, but the deployment or the production part of it was left to the clients. But that has changed. That has changed dramatically. And now, like, there are, I want to say, almost like 6 months transformations where the tech teams from consulting, they actually sit with the clients and then put things into production. So as this new batch and new generation of consultants who are both more technical, and they've also sat through all of the entire life cycle, they go into industry, I think that's going to change. But I think, like, as of now, it's like oldies like me who are more on the wrong side of consulting, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a very interesting observation. Is, I think I think maybe there is that shift happening. I've been seeing the candidate who is now dealing with more production, and it's true. If you work, if you go to a strategic, consulting company, their job is to provide strategy. They're not going to put anything in production. But if you're, looking at somebody who's been on teams delivering, I think it's maybe, again, I think the bias is to kind of just look at consulting and go, oh, consulting, maybe the shift is something that hopefully we'll see. I mean, obviously, you're doing amazing at Wayfair. You're running a large, B2B team in machine learning, and you're using those skills to your advantage, and you've been able to make the shift of, thinking short term to long term. So hopefully we start seeing a bigger shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited. Like I do have a lot of my friends who started off with me were still in consulting, and I'm seeing that shift already where now they're going towards more, not just recommending, but actual implementation. So yeah, hoping to see the shift soon.
Absolutely. I was going to go back to your team because I didn't, before we got into the consulting discussion, I was going to ask you the interesting part about your team. One of the many interesting parts is, as broad as it is, how do you balance, different, people working different projects, different, alignments, that team, I don't want to use the word culture, but there's like cohesiveness since they are so wide.
That's a great question. And I think this challenge actually got multiplied or aggravated during COVID, right? Because teams were remote. Like before COVID, people would sit next to each other and, even if you're, let's say, going to a conference room and just waiting for the previous folks to vacate, you would do small talk. And in this small talk, you would talk about, okay, what project are you working on? But that organic conversation, that cohesiveness was lost during COVID because we were all remote. So we had to make it deliberate, right? And I try to do a few things to make it happen. One is, of course, building that culture of having relationships not just specific to work, but like non-work too, which you would often have at in the office because you would have happy hours or team activities. So we try to do it a lot like online, for example. The other thing I try to do is use what people like in my team and make it fun. So hackathon is a good example where often people code, but then they don't get to code with each other, and especially not get to code with people from a completely different team. So we try to pair up people from across the team to have this, cross pollination, I would say, so that they get to work with each other and build that cohesiveness which they wouldn't be able to do organically in the day to day. And then finally, this is something people don't talk about as often, but and maybe it's non PC, but I'll just say it. In tech, especially, or in machine learning, you often have folks who are international who may not be native English speakers, so they don't often speak up a lot. So you want to encourage them, right? I'm personally myself not a native English speaker, so and I was given that mentorship from the beginning that hey, it's okay, you don't have to be perfect in English. So I do that with my teams. Like I encourage them to speak up, and when they do speak up, I recognize them, and I encourage them to present in like smaller huddles where they're able to present and they're already confident about the topic. So I think making these kind of small steps builds this cohesive team culture and creates that environment of camaraderie within the team, and that's been like I've seen a lot of success, and it just multiplies the productivity of the entire team.
Absolutely, I love that. That's I think more and more we're hearing about people creating those safe spaces because we're no longer sitting next to each other, and I think people have to be given more of that opportunity. I think that's fantastic, and obviously, you're seeing that, and you're making the adjustments. So good for you, and good for your team.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So I was going to ask you. I like asking guests about what they'd like to hear about in a future topic or a future question they'd like another guest to answer. So I was going to ask you: is there something that you'd like another guest to cover in terms of topic, or you have a specific question you'd love to hear somebody have a response to?
Yeah, I think one topic which is on my mind, and it's pretty philosophical. I would say two. One is less philosophical, which is machine learning going to be a victim of its own success? And by that, I mean, like, we're already automating everything. At some point, you'll have models that are going to regenerate themselves. So would we even need people and engineers to kind of build these models? right? So that's the first one. And the second one, which is super philosophical, and there's a lot out there, is are we ourselves in a simulation? And I've put a lot of thought into this. Then you can read up, especially with the metaverse and all of this happening. I think it's something I'm super fascinated about. So yeah, those are my two questions.
Awesome. Yeah, I think both are very, very apt, and yeah, definitely. I think the first one's super interesting to hear about. Having future models written by existing machines, and I think that kind of ties into your second question in some way too. So, if somebody out there understands the space and wants to come on and talk about it, I'd love to have you on the show. I guess if somebody wants to reach out to you, Yash, in terms of anything you've talked about on the podcast or anything, just in general, they want to reach out because they heard about you on the show. What's a good way of getting hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite active on social media. So you can reach me on LinkedIn. My name is Yash Desai. And if you just search for Yash Desai McKinsey or Yash Desai Wayfair, you're going to find me. I'm also active on Instagram. My handle is Y Desai, which is WHY, and my last name Desai. So you can find me on Instagram, or just good old email, which is my first name Yash J, my last name Desai. So that's yashjdesai@gmail.com.
Okay. We'll include some of those in the show notes. So if somebody does want to reach out to you, they can. I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate you coming on and sharing. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, it's been so amazing, talking to you and having this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Yash. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. If you do know someone that can talk about ML and basically its future and the need for writing future models, or it'll be self-written, or you know someone that talks about the conversation around simulations and the metaverse, hit me up. I'd like to have you on the podcast. And also, please share the podcast if you find it useful. I think that's how we've been growing, and I appreciate everyone does. That's it for this episode. Thank you, and goodbye.